This Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. local time in the Pacific Time Zone, streaming on the Big Ten Network, we have a Big Ten football matchup, the first of its kind. First ever meeting between the 4-4, 1-4 in Big Ten play Maryland Terrapins and the number 1, 9-0, 6-0 in Big Ten play undefeated Oregon Ducks, who are favored by 25.5 points at home in Autzen Stadium. That's where the line opened up, and the line has remained at Oregon minus 25.5, and the Ducks are given a 93.5% chance to win this game per ESPN's FPI. This matchup is intriguing because Maryland has been a team that has struggled in Big Ten play outside of their 1-point close win over USC. There's a world where Maryland is winless in conference right now, and this will be the furthest they have traveled out west and traveled overall by a mile all season long. The next closest distance that they have traveled to what they are undertaking this week was 2 weeks ago when they traveled to Minnesota, and Minnesota beat them 48-23. The game was not even that close. Minnesota dominated right from the get-go, and Oregon is the number 1 ranked team nationally, and as I have suggested multiple times in previous videos, I think Oregon is the number 1 team right now, not just by most deserved ranking, but by rating, by power rating. So it's a night game Eastern time. It'll be a night game for Maryland. It'll be a late afternoon game for Oregon, who's playing host, and the last time they were at home, they beat Illinois 38-9. So I'm going to preview this matchup and give a prediction, but before we do that here in a few seconds, can you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for me? That's the biggest way you can help support the channel. That way you join our community, we show up in your feed, we give you epic analysis, you watch us and engage with us, and also get to participate in our giveaways. We'll be doing a giveaway at the end of the regular season for multiple of our subscribers and viewers to celebrate 20,000 subscribers. And we want to hit 30,000 subscribers. And if we could do that soon, that would be epic. So please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Share this video around to other college football fans who want in-depth analysis and previews for a variety of games, not just the big ones, but also a lot of smaller matchups in the Big Ten, as those are still very important to the programs participating in them. And there's other content that is not Big Ten centered, because now that I have some help, now that College Football with Sam is truly building a team, I want to cover more stuff, because what we do here is awesome. So we're the best Big Ten football channel on YouTube, and thanks to you, we're becoming the best college football channel on YouTube. So share this content around, give us a like to boost our algorithm presence, comment your thoughts on this matchup, your preview and prediction down below. And if you want to donate to the channel to support the work we do here, check out our Patreon page and sign up as a paid member. Purchase merchandise from my merchandise store. The links to those are in the description and down below in the pinned comment. Or you can just stay on YouTube and give us a super chat in the comments. Thank you very much, and let's get rolling here. Looking at these two teams, it's quite interesting from a power rating standpoint. We like to start with power ratings, start with statistics, look at the broad, big picture, and dive into the details here on College Football with Sam. The details and the prediction are what is best, and we save the best for last here on all that we do. What's interesting is Oregon is unanimously viewed as a team that is trending up, as one of the best teams in the country. The only reason they're not number 1 right now in most power ratings, or at least not top 4 or top 5 in most power ratings, is because of their early season performances against Idaho, where they were ridiculously inefficient on both sides of the football. They outgained Idaho a ton in yardage, a ton in yards per play, and yet Idaho only lost by 10. And also against Boise State, where you look at statistics and you look at the fact that Oregon had 2 special teams touchdowns, that tells you that Boise State probably should have won that matchup on that day. At least that's what the statistics would tell you. Those things hold Oregon back in power ratings. Now, those who are close to the Oregon program and those who have listened to Oregon fans, and I hope that I have, and looked at the depth chart, know that Oregon, I think, did something very smart, and they rested as many potentially injured players as they reasonably could early in the season, and it nearly cost them against Boise State, but they rolled out a walk-on, for example, at center, and the offensive line had a lot of depth issues and some other injury concerns. The way they've treated the Jordan Birch injury tells me that they're being very cautious and like looking out for their players both in the long term, but also in their capability of winning a national championship in the long term. They're resting some players who, maybe I'm wrong in viewing this, but probably at times could have played. They could have just powered through it, but just rest, relax within reason, and we'll get you back soon. If I'm wrong, correct me in the comments below, but I think that there was a lot of tactical thought behind that. And watching how Oregon's played right now, I think the power ratings are still underrating them. They're only viewed as 21.7 points better than the average college football team in FPI. They're not even top 5 in FPI. Per S&P Plus, they're viewed as 27.8 points better than the average college football team. They're very close to number one. If they just gained 3 points in S&P Plus, they'd be the number one team. But I think they're only 5th in S&P Plus right now. In my potential power, they're viewed as 27 points better than the average college football team. And they're number one there. They're my number one power rated team. Potential power is my power rating system that I'm rolling out here, including in these preview and prediction videos. And yeah, they're number one nationally in potential power. You look at Maryland, they're viewed as 2.7 points better than the average college football team in FPI, 1.7 points better than the average college football team per S&P Plus. And from what I see, the statistics that I scrape, because statistics, position rankings, player rankings, how I view coaching staffs and the job that they've done, all of that's factored into potential power. And potential power says they're 7.5 points worse than the average college football team. So potential power is in agreement with the world about Oregon, if not a little bit higher on them when it comes to placement. As for Maryland, potential power is very low. Very, very low on Maryland. And I understand why that is. Now, it may sound foolish, just a little bit of a side tangent for me to talk in an objective way about my own power ratings, but I don't control everything my own power ratings do. I adjust things. In fact, I adjust a fair amount, but not a lot. A lot of stuff I leave up to the model and don't use the eye test or don't do further research on and just trust the model because it's already, in my opinion, well built. And I'm going to adapt it as the years and as the months go on, and whatever I can do to improve it, I will do to improve it. But I do find that interesting and also making sense, because who's Maryland played so far? I mean, think about it. The toughest opponent they've played thus far is Indiana. And Indiana was up 42-21. This is earlier in the year when I think Indiana was still figuring things out on defense. Recently, Indiana's looked very powerful and completely fundamentally sound on defense in a way that they didn't look, in my mind, earlier in the year. Maryland got a bunch of turnovers in that game, and they could never pull ahead because Indiana was that much better than them. Indiana's the best team they played all season long. USC or Minnesota is the next best. USC they beat by a point. They had the advantage of USC being deflated and traveling across the lower 48 states, and they had to mount a comeback. USC at one point had a big lead in that matchup, and Minnesota just blew them out. I mean, Minnesota depantsed Maryland, had a pick six. They made Billy Edwards look like a high school quarterback. They've not performed well. Oh, are we going to forget about Northwestern beating them 37-10? This is not a good team. And the potential power rating, I think, picks up on that more than other power ratings do. Points per play margin does as well. On a play-per-play basis, Maryland loses. They have a negative 0.075 points per play margin. That means for every one play Maryland runs compared to every one play their opponent runs, their opponent scores 0.075 more points on that given play. That's not good when your schedule, as we'll discuss, is not really that strong. It's not pathetic, but it's not Ohio State's schedule. It's not Michigan's schedule. They haven't played Oregon. They haven't played Ohio State. They're not going to play Ohio State, but they're playing Oregon this weekend. And their expected points added margin for Maryland is only 0.07, which isn't that good. Not terrible, but not very good. You compare that to Oregon, who has a 0.298 points per play margin. That means on a play-per-play basis, they kind of dominate their opponents. And they have an expected points added margin of 0.247, which means they're driving down the field more or getting better field position. They're just executing at a higher level and putting themselves in a better position to score, a much better position to score than Maryland is. It's fascinating how the Terrapins losing Taulia Tagovailoa and all they did in offense are, I think, really hurting them. And they returned a ton on defense, and that defense isn't good. It isn't. And I'm saying that to say that it's something I predicted earlier in the year, the preseason. In fact, very early preseason, I thought Maryland would be pretty terrible, if I'm being honest. And I was nervous about it because I've done that to Maryland under Mike Locksley multiple times, and then they find a way to go 8-5, a 7-5 regular season, and look much better than I thought they would. But I think I was correct in my preseason analysis. Quarterback has been downgraded, offensive line downgraded big time. The defense really hasn't stepped up. A lot of people expected Maryland to win the Big Ten now that they no longer played in the Big Ten East. Well, that was incorrect, and I thought that was going to be the case from the preseason. Rutgers was a team who I thought was going to win the scheduling lottery, especially with the schedule they have this year. Obviously, totally incorrect. But Maryland only has the 48th toughest strength of schedule, and they're 73rd in game control. Oregon has the 45th toughest strength of schedule, so slightly tougher, and they're 3rd in game control. The only teams who are ahead of Oregon in game control are Ole Miss, which to me is almost nonsensical. That's a total wire power ratings factoring in FCS games moment, because that's where that comes from, where Ole Miss had this insane performance where I think they were like averaging 20 yards per pass attempt or something crazy against an FCS opponent they played. Like, don't factor that in. That's what I love about teamrankings.com, by the way. They don't factor in games against FCS opponents, and I don't think that's really necessary when that's only one game out of the 12 on your schedule, and they give you 146 statistics to look at. So a lot of different points, but Maryland is the much better team and is the more dominant team, especially when you adjust for strength of schedule there, and that checks out, which is encouraging for Duck fans, not encouraging for Terp fans. The critical matchup here, if there's a path for Maryland to win, also the path for Oregon to completely control this game, is Oregon's rushing offense against Maryland's rushing defense. Maryland does have some good players along the defensive line, and I think that is a position of strength for them on defense. As for Oregon, they want to run the ball. They've improved at running the ball as the season's gone on, as the offensive line's gotten healthier, built more chemistry, as Noah Whittington has come on the scene at running back after suffering a brutal injury in 2023. The Ducks' rushing offense right now averages 5 yards per carry, which is 26th. This is in stark contrast to Maryland's rushing offense, which averages a wonderful 3.5 yards per carry. Good for 107th. Wonderful, obviously, being sarcastic there. Oregon rushes for 175.9 yards per game. It's 43rd. 43rd. Yeah, not 45th. And they put up those numbers while only running for 35.3 attempts per game, which is 78th. So they're ridiculously efficient on the ground. And their offense only averages 0.04 points per play, or punts per play, which is 9th, and 0.4 punts per offensive score, which is 6th. They are first in completion percentage through the air, averaging 73.06 completion percentage all around. You look at Maryland's rushing defense. Maryland's total defense is outside the top 75, and their scoring defense is too. Their rushing defense is inside of the top 25. They only allow opponents to rush for 110.9 yards per game and 3.5 yards per carry. And they're top 25 in both of those categories. They're actually better than Oregon in those categories. But then again, Oregon has played Ashton Jeanty and Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. So take from that what you will. Also, Cologne Mullings and Donovan Edwards, now that they played Michigan. I mean, they've faced a stable of anywhere from great at the very worst to elite running backs. So I do think there is that negative bias that still exists against Oregon's rushing defense. The longer the season goes on, the more that will decline. And I think after a game like this, where Maryland's outside the top 100 in every rushing offense category, Oregon's yards per carry allowed will probably drop to under 4.0 for the first time this season, maybe ever since the Idaho game, where no matter how bad you are, an FCS opponent is rarely going to run for more than 4 yards per clip on a good FBS team, even once having a down day. But that's the critical matchup there, is what can Maryland's defensive front, Donnell Brown, Jordan Phillips, Tommy King-Bisote, Kellen Wyatt, DJ Samuels, Dylan Fontes, Taze Johnson, Neo Avery, what can they do, especially that defensive line, against an Oregon offensive line with Iapani Lololu, Nishad Strother, Marcus Harper II, Johnny Cornelius and Josh Connerly Jr., and Jordan James and Noah Whittington? What can they do? What gives? Which unit gives? If Maryland's rushing defense is as good as statistically advertised, and they show up, and their passing defense, which is outside the top 100 in opponent yards per pass attempt, allowing 8.4, opponent yards per completion, averaging 13.6, in sack percentage, they only have a 3.56 sack percentage, which is 126th, or if they allow maybe around 200, 250 passing yards per game instead of the 292.9, which is 128th, if they can show up a little bit more in the passing defense and they really show out in run defense, this can be a game. This can absolutely be a game, because their offense for Maryland, not great, maybe not even good, but not trash either. They're top 5 in both pass attempts per game and completions per game. Maryland is on offense. They only average 7.2 yards per pass attempt, which is 70th, and 10.9 yards per completion, which is 107th. But when you're passing that much, unless you are running this crazy generational passing offense, when you pass that much, your numbers through the air are going to go down. I mean, that's the whole story of the air raid. Mike Leach offenses, like with Will Rogers, they'd pass a ton, get a bunch of passing yards, but their yards per pass attempt were low because they'd take anything you can get through the air. They treated short pass attempts or pass attempts in general at times like they were runs. With rushing offenses, I think it can sometimes be a bit opposite. Like the more you run, the more you commit to the run, the longer your yards per carry can get, especially if you're great there. But Maryland, they can pass, and they're much better at passing the football than they are at running the football. So to prevent Oregon from establishing total game control, what they have to do is they have to step up in run defense. If you're Oregon, if you're Dan Lanning talked about wanting to make sure the big house was emptied out before the end of the game, and it was. And I think what he can do, obviously he's at home, so he doesn't want to empty out Autzen Stadium, but what he can do is he can get that crowd really engaged by popping off some runs, methodically driving down the field, upping the ante, turning up the knob of anticipation, and then really getting the crowd involved. Autzen's loud, and I don't think Maryland is going to necessarily be prepared for this environment, which is why it's very imperative they bring their A-plus game and hope that Oregon does not even bring anywhere close to an A- game or a B-plus game. These offenses could not be further from each other. Oregon's better at everything. Quarterback, running back, tight end, especially with Ferguson healthy, and the offensive line. I take Dylan Gabriel over Maryland starter Billy Edwards any day. Any day. Dylan Gabriel right now is 4th in QBR. He's 4th. And he has 2,665 passing yards, averaging 9.3 yards per attempt, 19 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, a 171.5 passer rating, completing 74.8% of his throws. He's an 88.1 QBR, which again is 4th. And on the ground, Dylan Gabriel's 120 rushing yards, 3.1 yards per attempt, and 6 rushing touchdowns. You look at Maryland's Billy Edwards Jr., 2,314 passing yards, 7.4 yards per attempt, 68.4% completion percentage, 13 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, a 140.3 passer rating. In terms of QBR, he has a 60.1, which is 60th. It's imploded throughout the year. He had a really strong start to the year against UConn. Did all right against Michigan State. They've kind of been falling apart, honestly. Maryland has. You look in the ground with Nolan Ray, Colby McDonald, Roman Hemby. It's sort of sad because Roman Hemby had this massive true freshman, or it was really a redshirt freshman season in 2022 where he just popped off, nearly hit 1,000 yards, was averaging over 5 yards per carry. And last season, I don't know if it was injury or the offensive line. I don't know exactly what happened, but his production dipped down. And this season, he has 403 rushing yards, 4.7 yards per carry, and 4 touchdowns. Now, through 8 games, he's not breaking 1,000, which I think is pretty sad, especially given how close he was to doing that in 2022. Nolan Ray has 250 rushing yards for 2 rushing touchdowns. Billy Edwards Jr. has 5 rushing touchdowns and 71 rushing yards, and he has negative 125 sack yards on 13 sacks. So close to, in actuality, 200 rushing yards, 196 to be exact, if you don't count the sacks, in terms of rushing yards, which I think is just lunacy. It should count as its own separate thing. And he has 5 rushing touchdowns. So, yeah, is what it is there in terms of how they count the statistics. I don't like it. As for Oregon, Oregon's only allowed 10 sacks, most of them earlier in the year, negative 85 sack yards. Jordan James is going to break 1,000 yards potentially in this game if Maryland does not hold him back. He has 917 on the season, 9 touchdowns, 5.8 yards per carry. Noah Whittington has 306 rushing yards, averaging 4.3 yards per carry with 4 rushing touchdowns. Jaden Lamar's gotten involved. Jay Harris, Dejon Riggs are involved. They have a running back room that is set up for success in the Big Ten. Oregon does. And it's also due to their offensive line, especially their tackles, Josh Connerly Jr. and Johnny Cornelius, and Nishad Strother and Marcus Harper II. I would say that they're pretty set as well at guard. And as for Matthew Bedford, is Matthew Bedford, by the way, I'm looking at this, Oregon fans, is he healthy? The current depth chart says that he's not, that he's in the reserves. Is that true or not? Please let me know. Thank you. But their offensive line, regardless of that injury, is very impressive, and it looks better week over week over week. Let's check out the receiving end of things. Oregon's Tez Johnson will be out for some time, but it sounds like he'll be back at some point this season, hopefully sooner rather than later. Let's be praying for him. He leads the team in receiving yards with 649, 8 receiving touchdowns. Trayshawn Holden and Evan Stewart both have 462 receiving yards exactly. Holden has 3 receiving touchdowns. Stewart has 4. Terrence Ferguson has 355 receiving yards. Kenyon Sadiq is 230. Justice Lowe has 144 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. This is a veteran group at receiver with a lot of upside in terms of depth. See Jurion Dickey, and I bet you he'll break out next season. And at tight end, I mean, when you have 2 tight ends with over 200 receiving yards and they're averaging 13.5 yards per reception or more, you have a blessed tight end room, and they can block as well. For Maryland, their leading receiver is Ty Felton, 73 receiving yards, 907 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns. Caden Prather has 487 receiving yards and 3 receiving touchdowns. Dylan Wade leads the team, leads the tight ends in receiving yards with 254 and 2 receiving touchdowns. Octavian Smith, Roman Hemby, Preston Howard, and Shalik Knotts are other players with at least 100 receiving yards or more, and all but Shalik Knotts have at least 1 receiving touchdown. So that's looking at the offense there. Oregon, when you look on a points per play basis, they're scoring 0.298 or no, 0.551 points per play. That's 12th. And that number will only improve throughout the year. Their points per play margins we already discussed, 0.298. That's 8th nationally. They are not even top 25 in red zone score attempts per game, only averaging 3.8. But what I will tell you is they do get a lot of explosive plays through the air. And that's impressive given that I think Dylan Gabriel in large part just hits his checkdowns, does what he has to do. But he'll give you occasionally some punches. He'll take them. And something that I really like about Dylan Gabriel is that he's a calculated risk taker, and he's very, very good at that. Has high football IQ, and I think it's obvious to anyone who watches him. Defensively, I would take Oregon everywhere, and I don't think this should be a surprise to anyone. We just talked about Maryland's defense, who, in scoring-wise, is outside the top 50. Bless me there. They allow their opponents to score 28.9 points per game. It's 84th. Opponents to score 0.428 points per play. It's 92nd. They allow opponents to average overall 6 yards per play. 92nd. Oregon scoring defense is top 10. They allow opponents to average 16 points per game. 0.253 points per play. It's 10th. Only allow 4.8 yards per play. 24th. And 303.9 total yards per game. 10th. They're a very, very good defense. And they force opponents to punt for 1.7 times per offensive score, which is 11th. And 0.08 punts per opponent play, which is 19th. This is a great defense that Tosh Lupoy is man. This is a defense that I think is better than last year's defense, particularly up front, thanks to the addition of Derek Harmon and also Jordan Birch returning. So I look at this unit right here for Oregon, and there's so much to like here. There really is. Derek Harmon is one of the best players in the entire country. He right now is 3 sacks, 2 passes defended, 2 forced fumbles. Mateo Uyunglele has 5.5 sacks and a forced fumble. Jordan Birch has 5 sacks. Teodum Tuioti has 3 sacks, 1 pass defended. And on the season, they have 23 sacks, 7 interceptions, 39 passes defended, 6 forced fumbles, and 4 fumble recoveries. Maryland, by comparison, only 13 sacks on the year, and not even 20 passes defended. They have 9 interceptions, but barely any passes defended. I mean, this is a secondary that is just not good. Their leader in sacks is tied between Caleb Wheatland and Kellen Wyatt, both linebackers, each with 3 sacks. Wyatt also has 2 forced fumbles, having quite the season on Maryland's defense. These units just, they couldn't be further from each other, or at least it would be very hard. Like, I would take Mateo Uyunglele, Derek Harmon, Teodum Tuioti, Jamari Caldwell, Jordan Birch. I would take them over Donnell Brown, Jordan Phillips, Tommy Akingbasote, and Kellen Wyatt. And then at linebacker, I would take Bryce Betcher, whose story of being a walk-on is awesome, Jeffrey Bassa, Justin Jacobs, and Devin Jackson. I'd take them over Caleb Wheatland, Ruben Hippolyte II, Michael Harris, and Daniel Wingate. And in the secondary, I mean, right now, Oregon's secondary is made up in large part of incoming transfers, but Brandon Johnson, Jabbar Muhammad, Kobe Savage, Tysheem Johnson, and Nico Reed, I would take over Perry Fisher, Dante Trader Jr., Jalen Husky, Glendon Miller, and Brandon Jacob. I would, and I don't think there's much of a question surrounding that. So Oregon right here has a big advantage on defense. They have a huge advantage on offense as well. They're just overall the better team. And I think they're better in the trenches too. Better O-line, better D-line. Not much more of a comment that I can make. And they're also better special teams-wise than Maryland is. The Ducks are just better in every phase of the game. This is something that I've talked about in a lot of my Week 11 preview and prediction videos so far. In the Big Ten, there are a lot of matchups that I think are very lopsided in favor of the home team. I mean, think about it. Ohio State hosts Purdue. Indiana hosts Michigan. What Washington traveling all that way to Penn State is like could be very similar to what Maryland traveling all the way to Oregon is like. Although Washington's better than Maryland, much better, and Penn State, I think, is at the very best case scenario for the Nittany Lions, slightly worse than the Oregon Ducks are. I thought that before they lost to Ohio State regardless, and I was very high on Penn State as of just last week. Still pretty high on them, just not as high. So you have those 4 games, including this one, where the home teams are double-digit favorites, where power ratings say they're going to cover their spreads, including this one. It's just a massive advantage right here for Oregon over Maryland. And Oregon has the coaching edge. That's another reason why I think they have a massive advantage here. Dan Lanning is one of the better head coaches in all of the country, and his staff on offense, defense, and strength and conditioning has done a good job. I mean, these Oregon players are strong. They are big. Will Stein's an excellent schemer, and Tosh Lupoy is having his best season as a defensive coordinator, looking at his tenure briefly at Alabama and also so far at Oregon, doing a very good job on the defensive side. This leads me to predict Oregon to cover and win big. Now, Oregon, unlike some of these other teams that I'm covering, has no interest in running up the spread. We know James Franklin will run up the spread. Indiana will run it up until the final drive of the game. And Ohio State, I think, while not as inclined as those two to run up the score, especially Penn State was the main culprit, Ohio State, because of the athletes they have, and also the fact that Purdue's just awful. I mean, Maryland would beat Purdue by multiple touchdowns. That right there is going to be the biggest bloodbath of the week, which I released a poll on, by the way. So another reason for you to subscribe is so that you can interact with my community polls. I asked the question of what game between this one, the Ohio State-Purdue one, the Washington-Penn State one, and the Michigan-Indiana one, which would be the biggest bloodbath? Which would have the most lopsided result? I think that's Ohio State-Purdue, but this one comes close. And I think on the field, watching this game, eye test-wise, this is a big shot of that happening. I think this will look a lot like Oregon-Illinois, but worse, because I think Illinois is a better team than Maryland. So 45-7, Oregon covers, Oregon wins. It's just another big win, and Dan Lanning and Oregon move on to 10-0. For Mike Locksley and Maryland, with Penn State still on the chopping block and some other games, they fall into some serious, and I mean serious, danger of not reaching a bowl game, which would be pretty disappointing coming out of the Big Ten East Division and no longer having to play Michigan, Ohio State. You got Michigan State, who isn't extremely good, and lost to them. You've already lost 4 times to Big Ten opponents. 4. And you still have to play Penn State. And it's not like, what other teams do Maryland? It's not like Iowa's going to be easy. I mean, Maryland defensively, profile-wise, they match up well because they can stop the run pretty well. But I think that with Brennan Sullivan, I don't see any defense nationally stopping Iowa's rushing attack. They can slow it down, but stopping it's a different story. And Sullivan can pass. I mean, Iowa actually has at least one okay receiver, which they haven't had in several years, and their tight ends are always good. So if you take an L here, 5 losses, a loss to Iowa and Penn State both, is 7. And then Maryland's out of the bowl game conversation. So as much as a win here looks to be impossible, if Maryland can get one here, they need all the wins they can get. But I don't think it's going to happen. I think Oregon wins. Again, they cover, and they'll get closer and closer to reaching the Big Ten championship game. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Connell OH for being Heisman members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye for being All-American members. And thanks to John Lynn, Romain Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus for being all-conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Have a great day, everyone. Go Ducks, and go Terrapins.